Isabella Vance had a multi-billion-dollar empire, the power to move cities, and an army of doctors at her command. But none of it mattered. Because the one thing she loved in the world, her son Leo, was slipping away before her very eyes, the victim of a disease that no amount of money could cure. In her darkest moment, a strange boy from a poor neighborhood appeared with an impossible promise and a terrifying condition. "I can cure your son, but I need something in return." She thought he wanted money. She was wrong. What he asked for made her blood run cold, because the price for her son's cure was her life's darkest secret. The entire room fell silent, a supernatural silence that marked the beginning of her end and her only chance at redemption. That's just the tip of the iceberg. To find out how this impossible story ends, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what comes next. Isabella Vance stood inside a glass cage of her own, making. The penthouse suite of the world's most exclusive pediatric hospital was less a room and more a monument to her power. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked a sprawling city that she had helped build, a kingdom of steel and light that bent to her will. Her company, Vance Corp., didn't just construct buildings, it consumed skylines. She was a titan, a queen on a throne of concrete and stock options, revered and feared in equal measure. But in this sterile, silent room, her empire was worthless. Her throne was broken. Her gaze was fixed on the small figure in the center of the room. Her son, Leo, lay motionless in a bed that looked more like a command center, surrounded by humming machines that monitored every fragile breath. His skin was pale. His fiery red hair, once so full of life, now seemed like a cruel memory. For 6 months he had been drifting away from her, pulled under by a degenerative neurological disorder that had baffled the world's greatest medical minds. She had flown them in from every corner of the globe, offering fortunes for a cure, demanding miracles. They took her money and offered only apologies. Dr. Eris Thorne, a man with a reputation as formidable as her own, entered the room, his face a mask of professional sorrow. He held a tablet displaying complex charts and brain scans that, to Isabella, all looked like blueprints for despair. "Mrs. Vance," he began, his voice low and practiced, "we've analyzed the latest cellular response tests. There's no change. The degeneration is accelerating." Isabella didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on Leo. "Then try something else. Another treatment. A different drug. I don't pay you for no change, doctor. I pay you for results." Her voice was cold, sharp, the same tone she used to eviscerate rivals in the boardroom. Dr. Thorne sighed, a weary sound that grated on Isabella's nerves. "We are in uncharted territory. There are no other approved treatments. Anything we do now would be purely experimental, with no guarantee of success and a high probability of accelerating his decline." The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Her fists clenched. She had built a life on the principle that everything had a price, that every problem had a solution you could buy, bully, or build. But she couldn't buy new cells for her son. She couldn't intimidate a disease. For the first time in her life, Isabella Vance was utterly, terrifyingly powerless. Later that evening, as cold rain began to streak down the panoramic windows, she stepped into the hospital's public corridor to get a cup of coffee she wouldn't drink. The hallway was quieter here, away from the private wing. It smelled of antiseptic and quiet desperation. As she stood by the vending machine, a soft voice spoke from beside her. "He's very sick." Isabella turned. Standing there was a boy, no older than 12. He was small for his age, dressed in simple, clean clothes that had clearly seen better days. His dark hair was neatly combed, but it was his eyes that held her. They were calm, steady, and carried an unnerving depth, as if he saw not just the powerful CEO, but the terrified mother hiding inside. She gave him a dismissive glance. "I'm sorry. Are you lost? The children's ward is down the hall." The boy didn't move. He simply met her gaze. "My sister is here," he said, his voice even. "She has a problem with her lungs, but I'm not lost." He took a small step closer, and the air, Around them seemed to still. "I was looking for you." Isabella's defenses rose instantly. Another grifter. Another sob story looking for a handout. "Whatever it is you're selling, I'm not buying. Now, if you'll excuse me." She turned to leave, but his next words stopped her dead in her tracks. "I can cure your son." She froze, her back to him. The claim was absurd. Insane. She had the best minds on the planet working on Leo's case. This was just a child. Yet, there was no hint of a lie in his voice, no trickery, only a strange, unshakable certainty. She turned around slowly, her eyes narrowing into icy slits. "What did you say?" "I can make him better," the boy repeated, unfazed by her glare. "But I need something." A bitter, humorless smile touched Isabella's lips. "Of course. It always came down to this. Money. Is that it? You need money?" She reached into her purse, ready to pull out a wad of cash, to pay this ridiculous child to disappear and take his false hope with him. "No," the boy said, shaking his head. "I don't need money." He looked past her, towards the private wing where her son was. "I need you to fix something you broke a long time ago." As he spoke, a flicker of a memory, distant and dark, sparked in Isabella's mind. A bulldozer tearing down a row of small houses, the pleading faces of families being forced from their homes, and the eyes of one old man, full of a sorrow and anger she had never forgotten. This boy, his eyes were the same. She didn't know how, but it was impossible. He knew. "I need a promise," the boy finished, his gaze returning to hers, pinning her in place. Isabella Vance, the woman who had never been afraid of anything, felt a terrifying chill creep up her spine. She stared at the child before her, and for the first time in decades, she froze in absolute paralyzing fear. Isabella's fear lasted only a moment before it was replaced by a familiar, powerful emotion. Rage. Rage at the boy's audacity, at her own momentary weakness, and at the universe for putting her in this impossible position. She was Isabella Vance. She was not a woman who was cornered by children in hospital hallways. She controlled the narrative. Always. She took a deep breath, her composure returning like a suit of armor. She would handle this the way she handled every obstacle, with overwhelming force and public domination. She gestured for the boy to follow her, her stride long and confident as she walked from the quiet corridor into the main lobby of the private wing. The space was opulent and hushed, designed to insulate the wealthy from the raw edges of suffering. A few well-dressed visitors and hospital staff milled about. This was her stage. "So," she began, her voice echoing slightly in the large, sterile space. She turned to face the boy, whose name she still didn't know. "You believe you have something I need. A cure." She said the word with a dripping sarcasm that made a nearby nurse look up. "And in exchange for this miracle, you want me to fix something." The boy, Samuel, simply nodded. "I want you to give back the land," he said, his voice unwavering despite the attention they were now drawing. Isabella let out a sharp, theatrical laugh. It was a sound designed to cut, to belittle. "The land? You mean that worthless patch of dirt my company developed a decade ago? The plot where we built the Apex Tower, one of the most profitable residential properties in the city?" She took a step closer, towering over him. "Let me explain how the world works, little boy. People like me don't give back land. We acquire it. We improve it. We build the future on it." She saw the flicker of pain in his eyes and pressed her advantage. She wanted to crush this ridiculous hope, to grind it into dust under her heel. She opened her designer purse and pulled out a checkbook and a pen, the clicks echoing like gunshots in the quiet lobby. "But I am a generous woman," she announced, her voice resonating, for all to hear. "I'm sure we can come to a more practical arrangement." She scribbled on the check, leaving the amount blank, and held it out to him. "Here, write any number you want. 1,000,000, 10,000,000. Buy yourself a new house. Buy your whole family a new life. But you will never speak of this again." It was a public execution of his plea, a demonstration of her power. Money was her god, and she was its high priestess, offering a sacrament she believed no one could refuse. "Samuel," looked at the check in her hand, then back at her face. The pain in his eyes was gone, replaced by a profound, almost pitying sadness. "Your money is the reason he is sick," he said, his voice just loud enough for her to hear. He turned his back on the check, on her, and looked towards the large glass wall that separated the lobby from the intensive care unit. Behind it, just visible, was the door to Leo's room. Isabella's face hardened. The insolence was galling. "My money," she hissed, "is the only thing that—" She stopped. A sudden commotion from behind the glass wall cut her off. A nurse scrambled to her feet, her eyes wide. Dr. Thorne, who had been observing Leo from a monitoring station, bolted towards his room. Isabella's heart seized. She spun around, her eyes locking onto the monitors visible through the glass. The erratic lines representing Leo's heart rate and brain activity, the ones that had been a chaotic scrawl for months, were smoothing out into perfect, rhythmic waves. And then she saw it. Through the window of his room door, she saw the impossible. Leo, her son who hadn't moved voluntarily in weeks, was sitting up. His eyes were open, clear and aware. He turned his head, and his gaze seemed to pierce through the walls, through the glass, and find hers. A single word, amplified by the intercom Dr. Thorne had just switched on, echoed into the lobby. A word that was both a miracle and a ghost. "Mom?" The sound shattered the world. Isabella's breath hitched in her throat. The check fluttered from her numb fingers and drifted to the polished floor. The entire lobby had fallen silent, every person frozen, staring at the scene unfolding behind the glass. The air, once filled with her arrogant laughter, was now thick with a stunned, supernatural silence. Isabella took a step, then another, her legs trembling as she moved towards the glass, her hand outstretched. "Leo," she whispered, tears blurring her vision. But as quickly as it came, the miracle vanished. Leo's eyes went vacant. His body went limp, slumping back against the pillows. The monitors plunged back into their terrifying, chaotic dance. The whisper of life was gone, leaving only the deafening roar of the machines that kept him alive. The silence in the lobby was broken by Isabella's strangled cry. She looked wildly from her son's lifeless form back to where Samuel had been standing. But he was gone. The aftermath was a storm of clinical, detached chaos. Doctors and nurses swarmed Leo's room, their voices a low, urgent murmur of medical terminology. They ran diagnostics, checked the machines, and treated Isabella like a distraught parent who had imagined the whole thing. She was escorted to a private waiting room, a plush cage where she paced like a trapped animal, the echo of her son's voice a tormenting loop in her mind. Hours later, Dr. Thorne found her there. He had removed his lab coat, a pathetic attempt to appear less clinical. He held a tablet, but this time he didn't show it to her. "Isabella," he said, using her first name for the first time. "We've reviewed everything, every monitor, every reading." There was a brief, anomalous surge in his neural activity. It's rare, but it can happen. A sort of synaptic misfire. The movement, the sound you thought you heard. It was likely an involuntary muscle contraction coupled with an auditory hallucination. It can be brought on by extreme emotional distress. Isabella stopped pacing and stared at him, her eyes burning with a cold fire. "A hallucination? I know what I saw. I know what I heard. Everyone in that lobby heard it. They heard a sound from an intercom," he countered gently. "And they saw a group of doctors react. People see what they're directed to see. The mind is a powerful thing, especially when it's desperate for hope." He was dismissing her. He was patting her on the head and telling her she was hysterical. This man, the pinnacle of logic and science, was explaining away a miracle with condescending textbook definitions. Every fiber of her being screamed that he was wrong. She had built her life on tangible data and observable facts, and the facts were these. The boy appeared, he made a promise, and her son woke up. Then the boy vanished, and her son was gone again. It was a sequence as clear and undeniable as a corporate balance sheet. "Get out," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "Isabella, I just think you need to rest." I said get. Out! When he was gone, she was left alone in the crushing silence. The world she knew, a world governed by predictable rules of cause and effect, had cracked down the middle. On one side was everything she had ever believed in: science, money, power, logic. On the other was the impossible thing she had witnessed with her own eyes. She was stranded between them, in a barren desert of doubt, and she was dying of thirst. She went back to her penthouse that night, but not to sleep. She went to her command center, a state-of-the-art office that overlooked the city. There, she pulled up the hospital's security footage, hacking into their servers with an ease that came from believing that privacy was for people who couldn't afford to bypass it. She watched the footage from the lobby again and again. There he was, the boy, Samuel. He was clear as day. And there she was, mocking him, holding out the check. She saw the moment he turned his back on her, the moment he looked toward Leo's room, and she saw the commotion, the flicker of movement behind the glass. The audio from the lobby camera was muffled, indistinct. It was just enough ambiguity to give men like Dr. Thorne their plausible deniability. But for her, it was all the confirmation she needed. Her grief, which had been a slow, suffocating poison, now crystallized into a single sharp point of obsession. The doctors couldn't help her. Her money, in the way she had always used it, was useless. There was only one lead. One key. The boy. She picked up the encrypted phone on her desk and dialed a number. A man named Marcus Cole answered on the first ring. He was her head of security, a former intelligence operative who specialized in making problems disappear and finding people who didn't want to be found. "Marcus," she said, her voice devoid of all emotion except a chilling resolve. "I'm sending you a file. It contains a series of images from the West Wing hospital lobby. The subject is a boy, approximately 12 years old. His name might be Samuel. I want you to find him." "Understood, Mrs. Vance." "Is this a sensitive matter?" Isabella looked at the frozen image of the boy on her screen. His calm, knowing eyes seemed to stare back at her. "Marcus," she said, "find him. I don't care what it costs or what you have to do. Use every asset, every contact, every dirty trick you have in your playbook. I want his name, his address, and everything you can learn about him. My son's life depends on it." She hung up the phone. Her entire global empire, with all its power and influence, was now being leveraged for a single purpose: to hunt down one small boy. She had no idea what she would do when she found him, but she knew she couldn't go back. The desert was behind her, and the only path forward led directly to him. It took Marcus Cole less than 24 hours. The call came as Isabella stood before the windows of her office, watching the morning sun glint off the cold glass of her city. "We found him," Marcus said, his voice a dispassionate report. "His name is Samuel Ortiz, age 12, lives with his parents and younger sister in a tenement building in the East Hollow. I'm sending the address now. There's more. His family was one of several that filed a lawsuit against Vance Corp 10 years ago. It was during the acquisition phase for the Apex Tower development. The suit was dismissed. The Hollow. The name was a bitter irony. It was a basin of poverty and neglect that sat directly in the shadow of her gleaming, triumphant Apex Tower. The lawsuit was a faint memory, one of dozens of frivolous claims her legal team had crushed over the years. Annoyances to be swatted away. She didn't take her chauffeured Rolls-Royce. She drove herself in a nondescript sedan, navigating the cracked and crumbling streets of a part of the city she had only ever viewed from architectural renderings. The air here was different, thick with the smells of life lived on the margins. When she parked, she felt the eyes of the neighborhood on her. She was an alien, an invader in her $1,000 suit and her cloud of expensive perfume. She found the building, a tired brick structure leaning against its neighbors for support. Samuel was waiting for her on the front steps, as if he had known she was coming all along. He wasn't afraid or intimidated. He simply stood and looked at her. "You're here," he said. It wasn't a question. "I need answers," Isabella replied, her voice tight. "What is, this about land? What is it you want from me?" Samuel didn't reply. He just turned and began walking. After a moment's hesitation, Isabella followed. He led her through a maze of narrow streets, past children playing in the spray of an open fire hydrant, and old men watching the world from plastic chairs on the sidewalk. He finally stopped at a tall chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. On the other side was a perfect manicured lawn, an oasis of green that surrounded the base of the colossal apex tower. Her tower. It loomed over them, a glass god blotting out the sun. "It was here," Samuel said, his voice soft but carrying a strange weight. He pointed a small hand through the fence to a spot near the tower's foundation, where a gaudy, abstract sculpture now stood. "This was our home. And next to it, that's where the garden was." Isabella's patience snapped. "A garden? You brought me all the way here to talk about a garden? I told you, I will give you money, whatever." My grandmother was the keeper of that garden," he interrupted, his voice cutting through hers with quiet authority. "It wasn't for flowers. It was for medicine. For generations, our families lived here. We were poor, but we were never sick with the nerve sicknesses, the shaking spells, the fog that steals the mind. My grandmother knew the secret." He knelt and picked up a common weed growing by the fence, crushing a leaf between his fingers. "She said the earth here was special. There was one plant, we called it a manicer, the dawn root. It only grew in that one spot. From its roots, she would make a tonic. We all drank it. It kept us strong. It kept our minds clear." Isabella stared at him, a cold dread beginning to pool in her stomach. This was insane. Folklore. The ramblings of a desperate child. "That's a nice story," she said, her voice laced with skepticism. "But you can't possibly believe that some garden weed is a cure for a disease that has baffled modern science." Samuel finally turned to look at her, and the pity she had seen in his eyes at the hospital was back, deeper and more painful this time. "We tried to tell you," he said. "Before the bulldozers came, my grandmother wrote letters to your company. She begged them to save the garden. She even paid the local doctor to write a report about the plant, about the health of our community. She tried to warn you that you were destroying something that could not be replaced." The memory hit Isabella like a physical blow. The lawsuit. It wasn't about money. It was a desperate plea to stop the demolition. She remembered her head of legal affairs briefing her. "Some nonsense about a magic garden," he had said with a smirk. "We'll bury them in paperwork." And she had given the order. "Make it go away," she'd said, impatient to break ground. "Your lawyers called her a fraud," Samuel continued, his voice cracking with a decade of inherited pain. "They said she was making up stories to stop progress. They buried the doctor's report and threatened to have him fired from the public clinic. The final order to demolish, it had your name on it. I saw the paper once. You signed it yourself." The world tilted on its axis. The air rushed from Isabella's lungs. It wasn't just greed. It wasn't just a business decision. It was this. She had been offered a warning, a gift, and she had arrogantly, cruelly stamped it out of existence. The cure for her son, the one thing she would now trade her entire empire for, had been offered to her for free, and she had ordered it destroyed. Her son's illness wasn't a random tragedy. It was a debt coming due. It was a harvest of her own bitter seeds. She looked up at the apex tower, her monument to power and success. It was no longer beautiful. It was a grotesque, billion-dollar tombstone. A tombstone for a garden. A tombstone for the families she had displaced. A tombstone for her own son's future. The guilt was a physical thing, a crushing weight that buckled her knees. She fell to the ground, the rough pavement scraping her hands, and for the first time since she was a small child, Isabella Vance let out a raw, broken sob. The sound of Isabella's sobbing was swallowed by the indifferent city noise. For long minutes, she remained on her knees on the broken pavement, the sharp edges digging into her skin, a pain she barely registered. The immense weight of her life's choices pressed down on her, a force far greater than the gravity of her own wealth. The boy, Samuel, didn't move. He didn't offer a hand, Nor did he walk away. He simply stood there, a silent, patient witness to the complete unraveling of a titan. Finally, the storm of her grief subsided, leaving behind a hollowed-out emptiness. She looked up at him, her face streaked with tears and dirt, her expensive suit ruined. The mask of the CEO was gone, shattered. All that was left was a broken woman. "Why?" she whispered, her voice raw. "Why tell me this? Now? Is this what you wanted? To see me like this? Is this revenge?" It was a question born from her old world, where every action was a transaction of power, a move in a game of domination and revenge. Samuel shook his head, a gesture not of denial but of profound weariness, as if he were explaining a simple color to someone who had been blind their whole life. "Revenge won't clean the air that makes my sister sick," he said, his voice soft but clear. "It won't bring back my grandmother's spirit, which faded after she lost her garden. Revenge doesn't heal anything. It just breaks more things." He looked toward the hospital, miles away but starkly present in Isabella's mind. "And it won't help your son." His words weren't accusatory. They were a statement of fact, a simple truth that cut through all of her defenses. In his world, there was no profit and loss, only what was broken and what could be made whole. For the first time, she saw the vast, empty chasm between her way of life and his. All the power she had ever wielded was gone. Her money was a poison. Her influence was a monument to a crime. Her sharp mind, once her greatest asset, now only served to illuminate the depths of her guilt. She was adrift, stripped of everything she thought made her strong. She looked at the boy, this child who held the moral authority of the universe, and she did something she had never done before. She begged, "What do I do?" The words were a surrender, a plea for guidance. "Please, just tell me what to do. I'll do anything. I'll give you anything you want." The inversion was complete. The queen was kneeling before the peasant, asking for a map out of the hell she had built for herself. Samuel didn't offer her an easy answer. He didn't give her a list of demands. Instead, he pointed a steady finger at the apex tower, the glass behemoth that represented her life's work. "That building," he said, "is a lie. You told the world it was progress, but it was a wound. You covered the living earth with dead stone. My grandmother taught me that the land has a memory. It remembers what it's for. You built a monument to greed where a garden of healing was meant to be. The land is sick, and everything connected to it is sick too." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "It's not just your son. It's my sister. It's the families who had to move away. We are all breathing the air from a sickness you started. You can't just pay to fix it. You have to heal the wound itself." Isabella stared at the tower, but she saw it differently now. It was no longer a symbol of her strength, but a testament to her blindness. She had spent a decade building it, but she had never truly seen it until this moment. It was a scar on the earth, and its shadow was the darkness that had fallen over her life. "How?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "How do I heal it?" Samuel looked her directly in the eyes. His gaze was not one of triumph, but of shared burden. He was not her judge. He was her guide, showing her the first step on a path she never imagined she would have to walk. "You have to undo what you've done," he said. "You have to make it right. The promise I need is not for me. It is for the land. You have to give it back." He wasn't talking about a simple transfer of deed or a monetary settlement. Isabella understood that now. He was talking about something far more radical, something impossible. He was talking about restoration, an act not of payment, but of penance. The path to saving her son was not through a negotiation. It was through a complete and total sacrifice of everything she had built. The thought was terrifying, and yet, in the deepest part of her hollowed-out soul, it felt like the only truth left in the world. Returning to the gleaming, climate-controlled world of Vance Corp was like entering a foreign country. The language of profit margins and quarterly earnings sounded alien to Isabella now. The faces of her executives, once allies in her corporate wars, now seemed like strangers. She walked through the halls of her empire not as a queen, but as a ghost, haunted by the truth she now carried. She called an emergency meeting of the board of directors. They gathered in the top-floor boardroom, a space designed to intimidate, with a monolithic marble table and a panoramic view of the city she owned. 12 powerful men and women, whose fortunes were intrinsically tied to hers, sat waiting, expecting a briefing on a new acquisition or a market strategy. Isabella stood at the head of the table. She didn't use the projector or refer to any notes. She looked at each of them, her gaze steady. "Effective immediately," she began, her voice calm but resolute. "We are beginning the process of vacating the Apex Tower. We will be terminating all residential and commercial leases and preparing the structure for complete demolition." A stunned silence fell over the room, so thick she could feel it, pressing in on her. It was broken by a choked, disbelieving laugh from Richard Sterling, her father's oldest friend, and the company's vice chairman. "Is this a joke, Isabella?" he asked, his face flushing with color. "Some kind of bizarre stress test?" "It is not a joke, Richard," she replied. The room erupted. Voices overlapped in a cacophony of outrage and confusion. "That building is 40% of our portfolio's value," one director shouted. "Our stock would be wiped out overnight," another yelled. "On what grounds could we possibly do this? We'll be sued into oblivion." Isabella let the storm break around her. When it subsided, she spoke again. "The grounds are moral," she said simply. "The land was acquired unethically. It was built on a wound. We are going to heal it." Richard slammed his hand on the table. "Moral grounds? We are a publicly traded corporation, not a charity. This is madness. You're talking about corporate suicide because of a guilty conscience." He looked around at the other board members, his eyes filled with alarm. "She's lost her mind. Her son's illness. It's clearly compromised her judgment." The consensus was immediate and brutal. They saw not a leader making a difficult moral choice, but a woman breaking under pressure. Within the hour, the board had voted unanimously to block her directive. Their legal team was already drafting an injunction. Richard Sterling quietly began making calls, setting in motion the process to have her declared mentally unfit to serve as CEO. The story leaked before the end of the day. The headlines were savage. "Mad Queen of Concrete. Vance CEO's plan to demolish billion-dollar tower." The media portrayed her as a grieving, hysterical mother having a psychotic break. The wealthy and powerful residents of the Apex Tower formed a legal coalition, vowing to fight her with every resource at their disposal. Isabella was an island, completely surrounded by a hostile sea of her own making. That night, she sat by Leo's bedside. There had been no change, no second miracle. The machines hummed their steady, grim rhythm. Doubt, cold and sharp, pierced through her resolve. What if Richard was right? What if this was all a delusion, a fantasy concocted by a desperate mind? She was about to burn down her entire life, her father's legacy, everything she had ever worked for, based on the words of a child and a single, fleeting moment that the entire world was telling her she had imagined. She could still stop it. She could issue a statement, blame the stress, take a leave of absence. She could save the company, save her reputation, and retreat back into the familiar comfort of her wealth. She could accept her son's fate as a tragedy, not a consequence. It was the logical choice, the sane choice. She looked down at Leo's small, still hand. She thought of Samuel's eyes, not filled with hate, but with a sorrowful understanding. She remembered the feeling of the rough pavement under her knees, the moment the crushing weight of her own guilt had brought her low. In that moment of utter brokenness, she had felt a strange flicker of clarity, of truth. To back down now would be the real madness. It would be to accept a world where actions had no consequences, where a wound could be ignored, where her son's life was just a random, meaningless accident. She would not. Her choice was made. This was her crossroads, and she would not turn back. She picked up her phone and made a call, not to a lawyer or a publicist, but to the discreet, fiercely loyal head of her private wealth management firm. "Jean," she said, her voice steady and clear, all doubt erased. "I have an order for you." I want you to begin liquidating my personal assets. All of it. The stocks, the bonds, the offshore holdings, the properties, everything that is mine and mine alone. Turn it all into cash. There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. Isabella, that's billions of dollars. May I ask, why? Isabella looked at her reflection in the dark glass of the hospital window. The powerful CEO was gone. In her place was a mother and a penitent. Because, she said, I'm going to war, and I'm going to buy my own building just so I can tear it down. The weeks that followed were a blur of controlled demolition. Isabella, armed with a near-limitless personal fortune, waged a quiet, brutal war against the world she had built. It was a battle fought not in boardrooms, but through wire, transfers, and legal notices. She was no longer a CEO. She was an insurgency of one. Her holding company, funded by the liquidation of her entire personal empire, became a predator, hunting the shares of her own corporation on the open market. She bought out the residents of the Apex Tower one by one, offering them sums so far beyond market value that they were essentially bribes for their departure. Most took the money, their principles dissolving in the face of life-altering wealth. Her own. Board fought her at every turn, filing lawsuits and injunctions, but she countered them with a more expensive and more aggressive legal team, funded by the sale of her private jets and priceless art collection. She was systematically cannibalizing her life, turning every symbol of her success into ammunition for its destruction. Yet, as the last of the legal barriers began to crumble, she knew it wasn't enough. The transactions were sterile, private. She had committed her sin in the dark, through quiet memos and dismissive legal filings. Her penance, she realized, had to be done in the light. The wound she had inflicted was public, a scar on the community, and it required a public healing. She called a press conference. The room was a viper's pit of hostile journalists, photographers, and news crews, all of them eager to document the final, spectacular downfall of Isabella Vance. Her own board of directors, including a stony-faced Richard Sterling, sat in the front row, there to witness her corporate suicide. In the back of the room, standing quietly by the doors, were Samuel, his parents, and a few other members of their community. They had not come to gloat, but to watch, to see if her change was real. Isabella walked to the podium. She looked gaunt, exhausted, but her eyes were clear. She wore a simple black dress, stripped of all jewelry and pretense. She set aside the prepared statement her lawyers had drafted and looked out at the sea of faces. "Good morning," she began, her voice steady, amplified by the microphones. "For the past month, there has been a great deal of speculation about my actions and my mental state. Today, I am here to end that speculation. The world thinks I have gone mad. The truth is, I was mad for the last 10 years. I have only recently become sane." A confused murmur rippled through the room. 10 years ago, she continued, Vance Corp acquired a parcel of land in the East Hollow to build the Apex Tower. In the process, we displaced several families. This is a matter of public record, but I am here to tell you what is not on the record. She took a breath, and she confessed. She told them everything. She spoke of the community garden, the warnings from Samuel's grandmother, and the doctor's report her legal team had intentionally buried. She admitted to the predatory tactics used to force the families out. "We were told that we were destroying something of profound value," she said, her eyes finding Samuel's in the back of the room. "A garden that contained a plant with unique healing properties. We dismissed these claims as folklore, as a frivolous attempt to halt progress. We valued that cure at zero. We valued those people's lives and their history at zero. Our only metric was profit." Her voice cracked, but she did not weep. "That was my metric. My sin." She looked directly at Richard Sterling. "This was not a corporate failure. It was my failure. My choice. My greed." Then she turned her full attention to the families in the back. "I want to apologize to the Ortiz family and to every family we forced from their homes. I cannot give you back the years of hardship, and I cannot undo the pain I caused. But I can tell you the truth. The greatest irony is that my own son, Leo, now suffers from an illness that is a direct consequence of my actions. I destroyed the very thing that could have saved him. The room was utterly silent. The cynical journalists had forgotten their questions. The board members stared, aghast at this public disembowelment of the company's and their own reputation. That is why the Apex Tower is coming down, Isabella declared, her voice ringing with the force of absolute conviction. It is not an act of insanity. It is the only sane thing I can do. It is an act of atonement. We will tear it down, and in its place, we will restore what was there before. We will rebuild the homes, and we will replant the garden. This is not a negotiation. It is a promise. She finished speaking and stepped back from the podium, her body trembling slightly from the sheer force of the admission. The dam of silence broke, and 1,000 camera flashes erupted, a silent, blinding explosion. She didn't see them. As her security team escorted her from the room, she felt a sensation she hadn't experienced in years. The crushing, suffocating weight on her soul, the one she had carried for a decade without even knowing it, was gone. She was ruined. She was disgraced. And for the first time in her life, she felt completely and utterly free. The demolition of the Apex Tower was not a violent explosion, but a slow, deliberate dismantling. It came down piece by piece, a gradual erasure of a monument to greed. Isabella watched the process not from a corporate skybox, but from a simple folding chair on the sidewalk, sitting alongside Samuel's family and the other community members. She didn't speak much. She just watched as the sky, once blocked by her ambition, was slowly returned to the people of the East Hollow. Her public confession had transformed her from a villain into an enigma. The world's media had moved on to the next scandal, leaving her in a strange, quiet limbo. She had lost her company, her fortune, and her status. Richard Sterling and the board had forced her out, but it was a hollow victory for them. Vance Corp's stock had plummeted, and its reputation was in tatters. Isabella, in her ruin, had become a legend, a cautionary tale for some, a symbol of radical redemption for others. But none of that mattered to her. Her days were spent at 2 locations, the demolition site and the hospital. At the site, she listened. She learned the names of the people she had displaced. She heard the stories of their lives, of the community that had existed before her bulldozers arrived. She did not ask for their forgiveness. She knew it was something she had to earn, not request. At the hospital, she sat with Leo. Nothing had changed yet. He was still lost to her, a still figure in a high-tech bed. The doctors, aware of her public breakdown, treated her with a gentle, pitying condescension. But Isabella was no longer desperate. A strange, unshakable peace had settled in her heart. She had made her choice, and she would accept the consequences, whatever they might be. Her sacrifice was not a transaction for a cure. It was an act of atonement, complete in and of itself. Months passed. The last piece of the tower was hauled away, leaving a vast, ugly scar of concrete and rebar on the earth. And then, the true work began. Heavy machinery, paid for by the last of Isabella's liquid assets, arrived to break up the foundation. Trucks brought in tons of fresh, clean soil to replace the sterile, compacted earth. The day the land was finally ready, the community gathered. It was a cool spring morning. Samuel's father, a quiet man with kind eyes, handed Isabella a small burlap sack. It was filled with seeds. They were dark and gnarled, saved by Samuel's grandmother from the original garden, kept in a dry, dark box for 10 years, waiting. Isabella knelt on the fresh earth. It was soft and yielding. She, Samuel, and the oldest members of the community planted the first seeds together. There was no grand ceremony, just the quiet, hopeful act of placing life back into the wounded ground. And that's when it happened. Miles away, in the sterile silence of the pediatric hospital, a nurse watching Leo's monitors frowned. She called for a colleague. The chaotic, weak signals of Leo's brain activity were changing. A new pattern was emerging. Faint, but organized. Rhythmic. When Isabella arrived at the hospital that evening, Dr. Thorne met her in the hallway. His face was a mask of utter bewilderment. "I don't know how to explain this," he said, holding up a tablet showing 2 brain scans side by side. One was from that morning. The other was from an hour ago. His neural degeneration, it's stopped. Not only has it stopped, but we're seeing signs of regeneration. It's impossible. It's medically, scientifically impossible. Isabella felt no shock, no jolt of surprise. She just felt a wave of profound, bone-deep gratitude that brought tears to her eyes. She walked past the stunned doctor and into her son's room. She sat by his bed and took his hand. It felt warmer than it had in a year. The healing was not instantaneous like before. It was slow, steady, and miraculous. It mirrored the progress in the garden. As the first green shoots of the Amanacer plant pushed through the soil, Leo began to breathe on his own. As the plants grew stronger, he began to move. First his fingers, then his limbs. The doctors had no answers. They ran every test imaginable, publishing papers on the unprecedented remission of Vance degenerative disorder. They tried to claim it was a delayed reaction to an experimental treatment. But Isabella knew the truth. The cure for her son had not come from a laboratory or a pill. It had grown from the soil of a promise kept and a soul made whole. But healing the past was one thing. Building a new future was another journey entirely. Years later, the sound that defined the East Hollow was no longer the distant roar of traffic or the groan of industry, but the laughter of children. Where the cold, dark shadow of the Apex Tower once fell, there was now a sprawling community garden, vibrant and teeming with life. Rows of vegetables grew alongside medicinal herbs, and at its heart, a small protected grove of the Amanacer plant, the dawnroot, flourished, its leaves shimmering in the sun. Simple, well-kept homes, built in a style that valued community over density, surrounded the green space. Isabella Vance was a permanent fixture here. The designer suits and sharp heels had been replaced by practical jeans, worn-out boots, and a simple linen shirt, usually smudged with dirt. Her hands, once soft and accustomed to signing billion-dollar contracts, were now calloused from pulling weeds and turning soil. The hard, defensive lines on her face had softened, replaced by a quiet serenity that made her look younger than she had a decade ago. She had lost an empire, but gained a world. She was kneeling, showing a group of neighborhood children how to test the soil, when a small soccer ball rolled to a stop by her feet. "Mom, pass it back," a voice called out. Isabella looked up, and her heart swelled with a quiet, constant gratitude. A boy of about 12, with a familiar shock of fiery red hair, stood a few yards away, grinning. Leo was the living embodiment of the miracle. He was healthy, strong, and full of a boundless energy that still brought tears to her eyes on quiet evenings. There was no trace of the illness that had almost claimed him. He was just a boy, playing in a garden. "Go long," she shouted, giving the ball a playful kick. He darted off, laughing as he chased it. She was no longer Mrs. Vance, the titan of industry. She was Isabella, the woman who knew the best time to plant tomatoes. She was Leo's mom. She had used the last of her contacts and business acumen not to build another tower, but to establish a community trust, placing the deed for the entire restored neighborhood into the hands of its residents, legally protecting it from any future corporate predator. Her life's work was no longer measured in square footage, but in the health of the children who now ate the food grown in this soil. Later that afternoon, as the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the garden, she sat on a simple wooden bench, watching Leo play with his friends. Samuel, now a lanky, thoughtful teenager, came and sat beside her. He had his grandmother's eyes and her quiet wisdom. "He looks happy," Samuel said, nodding toward Leo. "We both are," Isabella replied softly. Samuel held out a small, steaming ceramic cup. "My mother sent this for you, a tonic, from the first roots of the new harvest. To keep your spirit strong," she says. Isabella took the cup. The liquid was warm and smelled of earth and herbs. She took a sip. It was bitter, but clean. It tasted like life. It tasted like grace. She looked out at the garden, at the new homes, at her son, healthy and whole, running under an open sky. She had torn down a monument to her power, and in its place, a community had built a home. She had sacrificed everything she thought she was, only to discover who she was, truly meant to be. She had traded a kingdom of glass and steel for a small patch of earth, and in doing so, had finally, truly come home.